speaker, not a co-host. So, oh my goodness.
Well, we were able to avoid their throttling us for just a little while by changing the name, but apparently they figured it out.
Yeah.
Well, that will work, Colonel.
We're just going to have to become a moving target and continually to change it with enough to avoid the algorithm, but not the followers.
Yeah.
This is going to get dicey. It's going to get spicy here very soon.
Oh my goodness. All right. So we are going to go back to our book, President's Secret War, and the CIA and Pentagon's covert operation since World War II with John Prados. So we're on chapter 3. Oh, I need to add that to the title. Forgot that part. That might help. Let's find it later. All right. So, the name of this chapter is We'll Get to It. We'll get it right next time. Although they never get it right. This one is set in the Balkans, the Baltic coastal plain, and it became the scene of the first big CIA paramilitary operation. It was a plan to unseat the communist government of Albania. And this is a new one. I have not run across what we did in Albania in any of our former research. So this one was very interesting to me, which my experience with Albania, which I'll just go ahead and share with you guys up front, was when they are, gosh, my hair's like sticking out. I don't know what's wrong with it. They were like, sorry, I'm distracted. They were like the boat people for Cuba for Italy. So it was not unusual on my way to work to find, I don't know, like hundreds of people, because I lived right by the Adriatic Sea, and across the Adriatic Sea is Albania. And they would come across the Adriatic Sea in boats and come up on the beach in like the San Vito area, which is where I was at. And then Brindisi is a port city where it's real easy to get transportation up to Rome and Milan and some of the bigger cities, Bari, Venice. And so we were warned on base to never, ever, ever pick up hitchhikers, which is, when I was there in the 90s, was still a very common thing to do, because a lot of it was fellow military people that's car was broke down or whatever, because there was not a whole lot going on in San Vito, Italy, that wasn't related to the military. So anytime there was like an influx of Albanian, quote unquote, refugees, you would get this, warning notice on the base that they're coming over again. So avoid picking up hitchhikers. And kind of just the funny story is, because they're Europeans, they, other than the fact that most of them that I saw along the road had blonde hair, you would not know they were not Americans, on their way to the base. Because we tended not to wear our uniform to work over there. Again, remember, I got there just as Kuwait invaded, or Iraq invaded Kuwait. And so a lot of us just kept our uniforms at work, and we went back and forth in civilian clothes, which is not all that uncommon. I did that the same the entire time I was at the Pentagon. Because there's obviously a lot of benefit to that. The dry cleaners are on base. You don't have to go back and forth, blah, blah, blah. And then you're in civilian clothes at the end of the day. So if you want to stop by the shops downtown, it wasn't a big deal. So I'm very familiar with the politics of Albania, only because we heard them all the time, because every time somebody was overthrown or there was a terror attack over there, again, swirling all around me, not knowing what's going on, we'd have a flood of refugees into Italy. So there had been a plan to unseat the government of Albania under the typical designation of it being communist. And the geography was a key element in making the campaign possible. Bases were available just a short distance away, to include our base, by the way. And while Albania bordered on only two other nations, Greece and Yugoslavia, both hostile to Stalin by 1949. So, and no, I was not over there during that time. So Albania's Iron Curtain, quote unquote Iron Curtain, was isolated from the rest of the Soviet bloc. The destabilization of Albania was to be a spoiling action in the Cold War, a rollback of the Iron Curtain, the elimination of Russian influence on the Adriatic Sea. And this is all hyperbolic because it was going to be a show thing. There's not really a communist significant presence, but we're going to, quote unquote, roll it back. And then it's going to be a feather in our cap because we're, pushing back against the, quote unquote, Iron Curtain. So the plan was to create internal opposition and depose the current leader and create small bands of commandos to infiltrate their local groups, like Stay Behind. Sound familiar? The plan, evidently called Operation Valuable, was discussed internally in British government meetings in 1948. And 1948 is the same time that they're destabilizing Italy and interfering with the Italian national election. The British difficulties with Albania had started in 1946 with incidences in which the British warships were fired upon. Later, two destroyers had been mined and sunk in a 3-mile wide Corfu channel along the Albanian coast. And Corfu is a Greek island that I had the pleasure of visiting. It's a beautiful place. Although the British had armed and advised Enver Hoxha, Hoxha, with their SOE during the war, by 1949, they were prepared to overthrow him. So again, notice a pattern here. He was their guy during the war, but after the war, they want to get rid of him. We saw that in Korea. We saw that in Vietnam. We saw that in a whole bunch of different places. In February 1949, the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, Bevin, agreed on the plan to, quote unquote, detach Albania. The Hoxha government, meanwhile, further encouraged British hostility by refusing to accept an International Court of Justice decision against Albania in the Corfu Channel case. Despite their own determination, the British wanted American help, especially financial backing for this operation. In March, William Hayter, Hayter, who was a British senior intelligence officer, led a delegation of their intelligence service, the secret portion of it, not MI6, the SIS, and members of their foreign office came to Washington, D.C. to argue for the U.S.'s support. The American responded with and consulted. So they met with the CIA, and they then took the initiative to the 10-2 panel. Operation Valuable was coordinated by a joint committee in Washington. The British representatives were the SIS liaison man and their Balkan expert at the embassy. Americans included Robert Joyce, who represented the State Department and its policy planning staff, a man by the name of James McCargar, McCargar, a detached Foreign Service officer for the Office of Policy Coordination, which is Frank Wisner's area. It also included Frank Wisner's deputy, Franklin Lindsay, with a leadership role in the Albanian campaign. So the first OPC, Office of Policy Coordination field officer assigned was a guy by the name of Robert Low, L-O-W. He just happened to be a veteran of the Cairo OSS during World War II. So he was going to be the guy in the Balkans. And oh, it just so happens that he was posing as a journalist already in the Balkans, but he's actually an intel person. Another pattern. Albania was Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner told Bob Joyce that Albania was going to be a clinical experiment to see whether a large rollback operation was feasible inside the Soviet Union. Wisner returned the British visit and conferred with his counterparts in London. He suggested the use of Wheelus, Wheelus field, which was in Libya. And just as a side note, all the base housing at the base I was assigned to in San Vito came from this base when we deactivated it. They broke it down, put it on a ship, brought it over to us, and rebuilt the housing. That was San Vito's base housing. The British pointed out that the island of Malta, a British possession, was much closer to the objective. So Malta became, oh my gosh, another island training base. And of course, because they have a big harbor, and that is where the USS Liberty eventually was towed to, because it's very isolated and secure, they begin training their paramilitary forces on Malta. So this is our first confirmation that NATO has a paramilitary training base on Malta. That for me is huge. So they used an old castle on Malta that's called Fort Bin, B-I-N, Gemma, J-E-M-A. It was activated as a training center. A boat was procured for like assault landings. And SIS rented a villa on Corfu as a monitoring station for communication purposes. A number of paramilitary experts from wartime were basically commissioned to participate in Operation Valuable, including Harold Perkins, who ran the operation, and David Smiley, S-M-I-L-E-Y, who supervised the training on Malta. Fillers were put out in all directions in Yugoslavia, which had halted its aid to Greek, quote unquote, guerrillas, but those are actually the freedom fighters that the British and later us were trying to overthrow, the nationalists. And Yugoslavia had broken with Stalin in 1948. They were asked to participate, though the Yugoslavians had approached the US through the CIA channels for military aid and were depending on this assistance to forestall any interaction with the Soviets. They did not want to piss off the Soviets. And that's what they felt would happen if they acted in concert with NATO. So Greece is going through their civil war thanks to the British and the United States. They also didn't want any part of Operation Valuable. The most important collaborators for this Albanian mission was Albanian immigrants that was found throughout Europe. So one of them was Julian Amary, A-M-E-R-Y, and Neil McLean, M-C-Lean, who had worked in Albania for the British SOE during the war. Again, more Gladio people. So the politics of Operation Valuable were indeed Byzantine. The most accessible Albanian leaders were those of the Bali Kombatar, or in English, National Front. They were centered in Rome and Athens. This group had collaborated with the Germans and Italians in the war, and they were very well established fascist in their views. Gee, they're going to work great for Operation Gladio because we love those fascist people. One leader had been the interior minister under the Germans and was directly involved in the massacre of demonstrators that occurred in February 1944. Another had been a justice minister during the Italian occupation. And after meetings with SIS and OPC, the representatives in Rome, Bali was brought into the operation in June 1949. Immediately following these meetings, the Western representation flew to Cairo, Egypt, to call upon the exiled King Zog, Z-O-G. Originally, the monarch had been a tribal entity in central Albania. He had seized power in 1924 in a coup and made himself king in 1927. So, Zog had led his own political movement, and when he learned that the West had dealt first with the Bali Kombatar, he was so furious that he asked the Western delegates to leave his room. Julian Amari saved the day by arguing that the time was not right for reestablishing the monarchy and that King Zog needed allies if he wished to ever achieve that goal again. King Zog finally relented, and Paris on August 26th, a number of Albanian exile leaders held a press conference to announce the formation of an Albanian National Committee. This group of leaders then secretly toured Britain and made open visits to the United States, where it was sponsored by the OPC-funded Committee for a Free Europe, another CIA front. Acquiring American entry visas for some of these leaders was very problematic because they were actual Nazis. But somehow that stuff doesn't ever seem to matter. But absolutely don't come in here without a vaccine. That's not allowed. The OPC stepped in, made sure their visas were not a problem. The state liaison man, Bob Joyce, reported back, "My friends at state said they would prefer not to approach visa division directly in this case." So they basically just did their own workarounds. Eventually, the Albanians got their documents, survived further misadventure in the U.S. immigration officials, and they went through Canada to get into the United States. Okay, so they end up being met by the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Llewellyn E. Thompson, in September 1949. Two of the Albanians went to New York to open an office for the National Committee. There on October 3rd, a senior Bali Kombatar politician, a 70-year-old Midhat Frasheri, Frasheri, suddenly died of a heart attack in the Lexington Hotel. OPC officer Lowe was called in to identify who the dead Albanian was and what his connection was. By coincidence, that same night in the Adriatic, a British boat called Stormy Seas took two parties totaling 20 Albanian partisans across the channel from Corfu, and the the SIS nickname for these guys were called the Pixies. 4 of the paramilitary men were killed. The other ones escaped into Greece. Albanian government security forces had known ahead of time about the landing and met them. One big problem with Operation Valuable was that one of its top men was a Soviet spy. Kim Philby happened to be working on this entire initiative. American and British leaders discussed Operation Valuable at the highest levels during Ernest Bevan's September 1949 trip to Washington. A CIA report later prepared said that they concluded a purely internal Albanian uprising at this time is not indicated, and if undertaken, would have little chance of success. Although presumably the CIA analysts were not aware of Operation Valuable, they nonetheless noted 9 weaknesses of the government, which means they absolutely knew about it. It highlighted the strengthened Soviet control measures along with continued improvement in the army strength numbers. Most significantly, the report concluded the possibility of foreign intervention in conjunction with widespread popular unrest and anti-government hostility represents a serious threat to the regime. An Albanian campaign fit squarely within the U.S. policy objectives in force since 1948, which included the intent to place maximum strain on the Soviet structure of power and control, particularly in relationships with Moscow in any nearby country. In NSC Directive 58, there was a basic policy paper on Eastern Europe, which was available in draft form to Secretary of State Dean Atkinson during this time. Approved with modifications by President Truman, NSC 58 provided for an ideological offensive on all fronts that should be maintained not only on the overt, but on the covert plane. And this is against the Soviet Union. In particular, we should increase the support and refuge that we may offer to leaders and groups coming from those countries. In his conversation with Atkinson on Balkan policy, Ernest Bevan inquired whether the U.S. basically agreed with the overthrow of the Hoxha government. Atkinson replied, they did. Are there, wondered Secretary Bevan, any kings around that could be put in? The picture seemed less bright in the wake of the failed October landings. This is evident in a December 1949 CIA report, which worried that the loyalty to King Zog might be eclipsed by other elements of national factions. And this is a quote from it. The settlement of differences among the exiled Albanians to provide leadership and coordination is a prerequisite of any effective resistance against the Hoxha government. Not even this turn of affairs, however, would assure the achievement of any successful resistance without material aid from the outside power. This combination of factors necessary for the overthrow of the Hoxha government or regime is as yet lacking. So no is the answer to that. Political differences would ultimately limit recruiting to strict quotas. 40% of the Bali Komentar, 40% of another party, and the rest from a minority party inside of Albania. After these disappointing starts, Operation Valuable sputtered on for months and then years and increased in level of resources spent on it. Americans became directly involved in 1950 when they began to mount their own Pixie expeditions. Formed by a recruit unit in Germany and set up bases there in Greece. Because by that time we had overthrown Greece too. 7 Poles with wartime experience in Royal Air Force partisan support units were hired to fly transport and parachute people into Albania. An OPC office using the cover of a movie producer opened in Rome. Oh, Hollywood and covert operations. Who would have ever figured that out? The first fully American pixie insertion occurred by airdrop in late 1950. Kim Philby retained his post in Washington through the summer of 51, when he at last fell under suspicion and was recalled. In the interim, there were dozens of infiltration with almost 50 pixies, virtually all staged by air and sea, and all failed. There was a spectacular failure in July 1951 after Philby had already been under investigation. 3 groups were parachuted in by OPC, 1 wiped out on landing, 1 surrounded in a house and burned alive, while 2 pixies of the last group of 4 were killed, the other 2 were captured. The overland infiltration only the overland seemed to have any success at all. In September 1950, they managed to survive for 2 months inside of Albania, but they couldn't drum up any resistance, which was their whole point. The most successful pixie was Hamit, Hamit, Majani, Matjani, who was a CIA favorite called Tiger. He made 15 incursions into Albania, and he did it all overland secretly. Majani's 16th mission, a parachute drop, was his last. The Tiger and his party were ambushed. Hajani's last mission was actually set up by Hoax's own security men with Soviet advice. After managing to capture a radio and 2 officers of King Zog's bodyguard sent in during the spring of 1952, they forced the captives to use the radio to mislead Majani's with glowing reports of a growing resistance that had already started, which is what led to him parachuting in and his capture. It was the same kind of deception that the Soviets had used and succeeded with in Poland. They received CIA aid in weapons and gold by creating a partisan movement at the end of 1952. At the time, the English SIS, frustrated by boat landing failures, withdrew completely from Albania campaign, but the Americans continued until the death of Majani. The Doksa government retained captives who were paraded for week-long show trials in 1954. Not even the Americans could continue after this because they were publicly humiliated on a national stage. Frank Wisner had simply been wrong when he insisted to Philby at an early stage that they'd get it right the next time. Widespread disillusion resulted from the Albanian experience, not least among them were the former pixies that kept getting killed. One of them says, "We were used as an experiment. We were a small part of a big game, pawns that could be sacrificed." That's what they feel about all of us. There was never enough chance of success. Michael Burke, Burke, OPC station chief in Rome until 1951, voiced a general opinion when he observed in 1982 that in the end, it was not possible to do without overt air and military support from England and the US. You couldn't just do it with locals. And that's why they began roping in the military. David Smiley moved on to an elite military special air service, then became a soldier of fortune. That's the British guy, David Smiley. CIA manager Franklin Lindsay left for the Ford Foundation, which is a CIA front, while Washington subordinate E. Howard Hunt welcomed his orders to transfer to the Latin Division, where he would be embroiled in coup after coup after coup with military support. Lesson learned. Michael Burke was himself transferred to Germany, where he ran agent drops directly into the Soviet Union using stay-behind units. It fell to the Southeast European Division Chief, John H. Richardson, to liquidate Operation Valuable. A wartime veteran of the Counterintelligence Corps in Italy, Richardson had been renowned for his skill, tact, and apparent ease with which he got Italian townspeople to accept Allied military governments. Flying to Rome after the Mazzati disaster, Richardson had the most delicate mission. Joseph Leib, L-E-I-B, the Rome station chief, still believed that the Albanian adventure could be done. Richardson sat down over drinks with his station chief and got right to the point. Albanian activities would end immediately. Then, asked Leib, is it over? All over. I don't know what they'll say about it in London. And then he turns around and looks at him and says, London already knows. You're basically the last to know. Russia itself was the heart of the denied area that bugged the hell out of the CIA and the Central Intelligence Group. So, but they still had orders to collect intelligence, and they basically would talk to anybody that they believed ever lived in Russia and spoke Russian so that they could use them basically as a liaison spy, whatever they could talk them into. So the immigrant population that had left Russia / the Soviet Union produced lots of information, but not all of it real. And a lot of those people were from the KGB. They had been put into the quote unquote refugees that had been allowed to leave and worked with intelligence sources, leading them astray on many different missions, and then taking the information that was shared with them back to Russia to thwart anything against them. They were very good at doing that. So the CIA still felt that they had no alternative but to deal with these people, even though they were humiliated time after time. By the 1940s, these people seemed well entrenched in France and Britain, and even some in China. They had their own network of political factions and social clubs. When the CIA and the British began to look for information on the Soviet Union, it was natural to go to these people who basically functioned as an underground. Principal ones were the OUN, which is the Ukrainian Bandera Bunch, and Stetsko, and the NTS. The Ukrainian UVO, better known by the OUN moniker, standing for Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was a creature of the Ukrainian nationalists. This organization was founded in Paris in 1920 by refugees. From the beginning, the Soviets recognized the OUN as a threat. The organization responded by infiltrating Russia. The Soviets scored blows against the OUN repeatedly, and one of the OUN leader by the name of Simon, S-Y-M-O-N, Petlura, P-E-T-L-Y-U-R-A, was shot 7 times on a Paris street. And in 1938, when original OUN founder Ihan Konovalets, Konovalets, was handed a bomb in a Rotterdam cafe and was blown up. Back in Ukraine, OUN established resistance groups and carried out occasional sabotage until World War II intervened. At that time, nationalist Stephen Bandera was serving a life sentence for his murder of a Polish minister of the Interior. Bandera escaped during the German 1939 invasion of Poland and was elected head of the OUN. 2 years later, the German invaded Russia, and Bandera and other OUN leaders associated themselves with the occupation authorities. Bandera became disillusioned when the Germans with the Germans, supposedly, and they imprisoned him. But when he agreed to resume cooperation toward the end of the war, he was released. In mid-1944, Bandera and other Ukrainians formed the Supreme Liberation Council to fight the Soviets. Now, because we've read so much about the OUN, there are other accounts of that. The other accounts basically say that him and Stetsko were basically taken to Germany and given special training by people like Otto Skorzeny to actually create their own stay behind, that he wasn't actually in jail, that he was basically in jail like Otto Skorzeny and Galen was in quote unquote jail, but nothing ever happened to him after World War II. That's another pattern, by the way. During the Russian-German War, OUN was armed by the Germans. Many Ukrainians fought in auxiliary units with German officers embedded in these units. They later formed the core of the OUN paramilitary army, what we refer to as the stay behind, which still exists today. Ukrainians claim a strength of over 50,000 by the time September 1944 rolled around. They were scattered all over Ukraine, Poland, and even Czechoslovakia. From the summer, when the last German troops were driven from South Russia, the OUN fought on its own. This was a partisan warfare on a grand scale, and it did not end with the end of the war. Courier links broken down after May 1946, but in 1947, OUN leaders still claimed as many as 100,000 partisans under arms in large formations within cities throughout Ukrainian territory. In 1946, Soviet military officials repeatedly demanded the extradition of Bandera from American occupation zones because he was a war criminal. Bandera, who had fled to the American zone at the end of the war, was warned to hide, even though the Army, the U.S. Army, did have information involving him in blatant war crimes. American authorities informed the Soviets that they didn't know where Bandera was. On the ground, the partisan struggle continued for the liberation of Ukraine, including those parts of it relocated within the Poland and Czechoslovakia borders. Ukrainians had suffered terribly during the quote unquote Great Patriotic War, which of course is what the Soviets called it. 3 million sent to Germany as forced labor. Half that number were still missing, 2.5 million killed. There was still plenty of reasons for them to support the OUN, and very few to welcome the return of Stalin. So the point here is that when the Germans conquered that portion of Ukraine, they captured them and put them in basically death camps in Germany. Among the Hutzul, Hutzul, who inhibited the footlands of a mountainous area, OUN's feelings ran especially strong. This eased difficulties of filtering partisan bands and couriers back and forth from the Czechoslovakia, Polish, and Soviet border area. Stalin's response was vigorous and sustained. Large Red Army forces were posted throughout Ukraine. Communist Party activists sent to the Ukraine and Moldova included Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and Cherenko. Post-war work in South Russia was clearly a stepping stone to the powerful that eventually controlled the Soviet Union. A military appointment that is worth noting is that of Marshal Zhukov, Zhukov, who was sent to command Odessa's military district in 1946. He established himself as a war hero and one of Stalin's best generals. The State Department intelligence reports in 1947 observed the possibility that he was being used to stabilize the situation in Ukraine. And when he took command, the military operations assumed major proportions. In 1946, several times the intelligence reports claimed that the liquidation of some hundreds of partisans was occurring that had basically been former Nazis. And so he's just kind of mopping everybody up. And these operations were happening in southern Poland, Czechoslovakia, Soviets, and the OUN, although still powerful, was running into a bloody chainsaw called the Soviet Army. The Czechs' army made strenuous efforts to seal off their borders. They were unable to prevent the infiltration of Ukrainian bands. The Czech defense minister, Savada, estimated that 100 or 200 partisans were still at large inside their country and had formed into smaller units in order, and they were in like Lublin and Krakow, and that they had 2,000 partisans killed or captured. As for the Soviets, Khrushchev declared the Ukrainian people have destroyed an insignificant bunch of Ukrainian nationalists and will annihilate the remnants of them. Khrushchev probably made those remarks with some satisfaction because 4 years before, while accompanying Soviet armies advancing across Ukraine, he had been forced to take extraordinary measures to protect himself while traveling because of those terrorist bands of people. But Khrushchev's January 1948 speech was intended for public consumption. In fact, the Ukrainian partisan struggle was far from over. Members of the unit had escaped to Germany in 1947. Company 95 of the Ukrainian insurgent army previously estimated OUN's armed strength to be between 50 and 200,000 soldiers, but also revealed details of a structure that had set up regiments. Each one had 6 to 8 machine guns, an equal number of mortars, and small arms. So they were not very well equipped. This information of the OUN capability did not prevent the State Department's intelligence reports as basically saying that Ukraine was probably no longer a serious issue. But it also did prevent Ukrainian appeals for aid. The Conference of Immigrants meeting in New York adopted a resolution to this effect and sent a telegram to President Truman. Quote, Ukraine is fighting for its freedom by means of its powerful insurgent army. We endorse her fight for freedom on the grounds of the Atlantic Charter. We believe that Russian aggressiveness would lose its power if the Ukraine were liberated and acquired self-rule, unquote. So eventually they get self-rule, but then we just go over and overthrow their government a couple of times. No big deal. All right. So no American aid was forthcoming. And this was seen as a measure that could be, so let's see. Ukrainian cities had basically been the initial air offensive of targets of an atomic war. And the US saw this as a means that could be exploited in a psychological war against Russia. At the same time, there was a growing interest in operations in these quote unquote denied areas. In 1948, intelligence study done called NSC 50 advocated relations with the anti-Soviet resistant groups, i.e. Nazis, as a prime means of getting information. Wisner was working with the Galen organization, and in 1950, he proposed to insert agents of their stay-behind units into Russia. The Pentagon's wish list briefed to the CIA included up to 2,000 agents to be inserted into the Soviet Union. Though one such unit conducted a daring 5-week raid into Romania, Brigadier General Roman, and I'm just going to say his last name, or spell it, Shuchewaycz, who was the commander of an insurgent army, ordered the deactivation of the army into an underground unit in 1949. which is about the time they're setting up all the stay-behind units. The CIA's Ukraine operation began 2 days later. The team of 2 agents dropped by parachute after a flight from Germany across Central Europe. CIA's Russian efforts in a joint operation with the British. The British chose the OUN as an organization to work with. Officers at the OPC, meaning the CIA, believed that the tide of history was running against the OUN, and they wanted to collaborate with some organizations that were outside of the Ukrainian but still Russian linguist faction. One of them was called the National Labor Alliance, or NTS. NTS was formed in basically a wave of people that had come over from the Soviet Union that had previously been under the Tsar's rule. It had been founded in Belgrade in 1930, and it said that it wanted a parliamentary democracy in the Soviet Union as well as Ukraine. Like OUN, the NTS maintained couriers in and out of Russia. Like Bandera, the NTS had collaborated in the early German wartime administration in Russia, but unlike OUN, NTS made no effort to create partisan forces. Rather, its leader, Dr. Georgy S. Okolovich, was an NTS kind of the leader. And then the kind of philosopher guy behind it was Vladimir Poremski. They basically wanted to use sectors of the Russian society that would naturally oppose the communists and ultimately rise up and try to overthrow the Soviet rule, which was basically more the educated elite people that they thought that they could kind of appeal to. So they created Radio Free Russia and created all of these pamphlets and began distributing them. And there was relationships with the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps as well, the Army G2, the Gehlen organization, which is the German counterpart to the CIA. They had relationships with the British SIS. So soon, all of this is in the works. You've got an entire Russian operation going on now, and Frank Wisner's organization was working with the Gehlen B&D and did screening and training and recruiting of Russian immigrants under the same program that they had just ran and failed in the Balkans. So there were a number of estimates of special forces required, which basically the initial target was around 5,000. And all of these people are going to have had contact or actually had been card-carrying Nazis. So the SIS took the lead to use these people to actually conduct infiltration exercises into Russia. According to Kim Philby, the Anglo-American cooperation on both the Soviet denied area schemes in the Baltic and Ukraine was very chilly. That was his word he used to describe it. On the Ukrainian situation, Philby said the CIA, arguing that Bandera was anti-American, that the OUN represented extreme nationalism with fascist overtones. They were all Nazis. The guy Gehlen is an actual Nazi. Otto Skorzny's a Nazi. Like that bothered anybody? Come on. Henry Carr, C-A-R-R, which ended, let's see, the SIS chief for Northern Europe, Henry Carr, ended up openly accusing his counterpart in the CIA of wholesale lying. The occasion was a European tour in 1951 with Alan Dulles, who was recently hired by the CIA as a deputy director of plans and basically was working directly with Wisner. Dulles's subordinates had encouraged the SIS, which is the British, to abandon Bandera and the OUN. At the London conference, SIS officials simply refused to do so. 2 SIS missions were sent into Russia during 1950. Both disappeared without a trace, never to be heard of again because the Soviets were on to them. Support continued with both the Ukrainians, OUN, and the NTS. In 1951, the British dropped 3 parties of 6 men each into Ukraine. None of these teams were ever heard from again. They were repeating what they had just went through in Albania. A CIA 4-man team that infiltrated through the Baltic coast was unproductive, as were 3 missions involving 5 agents dispatched to Ukraine and Moldova. Planes to drop these agents into the denied areas were flown by the British through Cyprus and by the CIA through Greece and West Germany. And this, at the end of the day, is why we cooed Greece, because we wanted Greece as a staging area. Intelligence agents operated at grave disadvantages to the Soviet Union. The population was closely controlled. State security was everywhere. The CIA learned the details of the printing processes the Russians used to produce their internal passports and other documents. The power of the partisans was broken by the time the agent teams began to arrive. Remnants of the OUN and Bandera forces held out among the Hutzel in the Carpathian until 1952, but the bands were slowly tracked down and eliminated by the Soviets. Another 16 agents were lost by the Americans in at least 5 missions between 1952 and 53, so the losses are mounting. Soviets had the advantage, obviously, of information because they had Philby, who was a spy. They also received reports from Heinz FELFE, who was a senior officer in Galen's organization, who was a Russian spy, and also from a Canadian spy by the name of Gordon Lonsdale, Lonsdale. Lots of penetration there, people. So that basically is kind of we know how it turned out, obviously. It was completely ineffective. And there was one, I'll just briefly mention this and we'll close out this chapter. There was a thing called the KHOKLOV, Khokhlov affair. It was the first of a series of similar Soviet measures against immigrant figures. Oklalovich was beaten during an abortive kidnapping, and NTS member Poremsky was the subject of another abortive murder attempt. The Russians were more successful with Ukrainian-level Lev Rebet, R-E-B-E-T, whom they assassinated in 1957. They also killed senior Eastern Europeans, broadcasters that were working for the Radio Free Europe. There was an entire campaign. It climaxed in October 1959 when Stephen Bandera was killed outside his Munich apartment building with a dose of cyanide fired from an ingenious gun. Secret warfare against Russia ground to a halt. The failure of the OUN and NTS ended up with both of them being very ineffective against the Soviet Union. Although they didn't necessarily stop their operations, it basically was acknowledged that they were severely lacking when it came to effectiveness. A guy by the name of Michael Burke had had enough after working for OSS and OPC on Albania, and now many of the Soviet campaigns. He wanted to move on. Burke left the CIA to become manager, that you just can't make this shit up, of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, and later president of the New York Yankees. Burke, at least could move on. That was not the case with many of the other people because they were dead because of dumbasses putting them into the Soviet Union, thinking they could survive time after time after time. So that finishes that story. We move on to Asia in our next chapter.
Question. Have you heard about the committee? No, Company 4000? Did that come up in this Albanian thing whatsoever?
No.
Okay, because I happened to stumble across it and it's very vague, but it has to do with exactly what you're describing and this whole operation theme, and it came up in a related search. I posted it down below.
Awesome. Yeah, they didn't.
Hey, bro.
I don't think any of this was like at the unit level, but that is a good way of tracking some of these people because a lot of those articles that you find, Bridget, as you well know, do have names that we can then later track to other operations to prove that they are in fact part of Gladio. So thank you for finding that.
Absolutely. And I also actually found military breakdown from the USMC of that whole operation. And actually it's not written in a, like, it's all about covert paramilitary and how they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. So I just thought that was interesting because most of the time when I find them, they're making light of it, you know. It's generally not critical whatsoever.
And don't you,
in this particular case it was.
and don't you love that we know all their code words now?
Oh my God. Every time I see philanthropist, I'm just like through the roof. Because it is absolutely a rubber stamp that this guy is part of the deep state.
I agree. What you got there, Ron?
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, look, I'm actually a chapter ahead of you right now. And
Well, I've already read the book. You're not ahead of me.
well, I mean, you know what you're reading right now. But you know, as I'm reading a lot of this stuff, it's kind of like bringing in like a grand picture of this is the beginning stages of trying to establish what I believe to be global government, and they're destabilizing all these areas all
Yes.
over the world.
Yes.
And they're feeling their way out. They don't exactly know what they're doing. It's a cat and mouse game. But the ultimate objective is, you know, and this is the origins of where we are today. But what we've, you know, they've perfected it substantially. However, you know, on the bright side, I feel like, you know, the fact that we are bringing light to a lot of these things by looking through this old history, we're exposing them, and now they can no longer get away with a lot of this shit. So, anyway,
So, Ron,
that quick comment. Yeah, go ahead.
You just discovered what we discovered 18 months ago. We knew as soon as we read like the first 4 books what we had stumbled onto. And that's the reason why we moved over to X so that we could share what you just described as, to me, one of the most amazing discoveries ever. We discovered what their plans were as part of the New World Order and how they were going to do it by going around the world installing fascist dictators in order to take over the world. And every single operation, one by one by one, got more ambitious, more bold as they learned from their mistakes of the previous one. And they have perfected the regime change operations. They have buried the fact that the CIA is doing it by Ronald Reagan approving the National Endowment for Democracy and them eventually recreating the USAID and the slush funds for the IRI and the unions and the Chamber of Commerce, so they could go around and have a multi-pronged. It's just got bigger and bigger and more bold until they basically have gotten so sloppy in this, as far as I'm concerned, because they thought they were going to get away with it. And then Donald Trump came on the scene. And now, because they exposed themselves in the last 20 years of sloppy shit, it is easy to go back and look at their models that started back post World War II and realize we're living in the middle of it right now.
That is correct. And you know, I like to use this analogy. I think it's very apropos. Are you familiar with the movie Miracle about the
Ron, I don't watch movies.
Okay, all right. So, but you are familiar with the American hockey team beating the Russians at Lake Placid in 1980?
I am.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is the Russians were the deep state, and the Americans in that are the people. And the in that movie, at the very tail end of the hockey game, the Russians were down by a goal. And typically, if you know anything about hockey, you're going to pull your goalie so you can have an extra skater to try to do what you can to tie the game, so you can send it into overtime or whatnot. Well, in this particular instance, what I'm seeing is the deep state is, you know, they've been winning for so long, and people haven't been paying attention. Now that they're still trying to play the exact same games using the same tactics, and they're failing, and they don't know what to do.
Exactly.
They don't know what to do. And that was perfect. It was perfectly encapsulated in that movie with the very tail end. Is that they're not pulling Michigan, they're not pulling the goalie. And the American coach said he doesn't know what to do.
Because they've never,
where we are right now.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Very great analogy. Bridget, go ahead.
Two things. One of them, I wanted to forward on to Ron, actually, a thank you, because one of the things, you know, I'm sure you saw that we're going to do the interview with Paul Williams. Cousin It had told me to forward on, this was yesterday, but you had already popped out, a thank you, because he got the idea from actually a broadcast that you had said something about reaching out to him. And that's what kind of spurred her on to the goal of finding a way to contact him. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Awesome. That's awesome.
And the other thing was, she said Bandera's wife and kids moved to Toronto, where there's lots of Nazi monuments in particular.
Lots of them.
And and people connected to 09A, the base, Rise Above movement, located in New York. So there you have it.
There you go. So, very, very interesting information, and I think foundational to being able to see what we're dealing with now. And that's why I love going back and sharing with you guys. And this one here, again, this is a normal book that you would find that it's called President's Secret Wars. Nowhere in here does it mention the word Gladio. Nowhere. But secret wars and covert operations, almost 100% of the time when we search on them for articles, when at the very beginning of this, when we were looking for leads, those are the words: paramilitary, covert operations, and secret wars. And you can find mountains and mountains and mountains of stuff that all deal with Gladio. It doesn't all deal with Gladio. A lot of it did. And there was like a million rabbit holes to bring all of this information to you guys and be able to kind of dig up a collective group of information that took months to organize to be able to kind of present it, not just even present it, but to get it straight in our brain. Because again, we collectively were working through what is it? initially. How big is it? Because we had never even heard of Operation Gladio. And, okay, so they ran drugs and bought some weapons thinking the Russians were coming over. And that's literally what you start off with Paul Williams' book, and the role model of Chiang Kai-shek. Well, then every piece of that had to be looked at. The entire drug thing had to be looked at. The entire Chiang Kai-shek apparatus, which then took us, of course, to Korea, to Vietnam, to Formosa, which they turned into Taiwan. And every single one of them had like 10 rabbit holes. And so it has just been a kind of a methodical way. And when I find these books that add new dimensions, like I said, I'd never heard covered in all of the books that we've read so far, or researched or articles, I've never heard of it being in Albania. I'd never heard of them actually trying to do the whole stay behind thing in Albania. And so we're going to get into a couple other very unique things in this book, which is why I wanted to use this book. SR71, go ahead.
Thank you, Colonel. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I couldn't hear a word Ron said for some reason. Don't know why.
Huh.
But anyway, what surprises me out of all of this is up until this point, this particular subject with Albania, what's going on, what we had found out all through Asia and all through Latin America was the CIA pretty much did everything on their own. They weren't involved with many of the other intel services at all. In this case, with Albania, seems like they pulled in a whole cadre of people, and then they attempted the same thing in Ukraine when they failed in Albania.
So let me, that's a very interesting observation. Let me say this. So time frame wise, Latin America and Asia happened after this. Okay, so I think the CIA figured out having multiple players is not a good idea. That somebody has to take lead, and it ended up being the CIA. So this is at the very beginning. This is 1948, 1949 timeframe. So this is before, there's stuff going on in these other areas, but before they actually launched their first coup in any of these other areas, they're kind of wading in the water here. And you're right in your observation that you've got the Galen organization actively involved because, of course, they set up all the stay behind units. So it made sense for them to be involved. And then you had the MI6 people involved as well. Now, what's interesting is because we've not spent any time just looking at MI6 coups themselves, there are some. And the one that sticks out most is when they tried to by themselves coup Mossadegh in Iran, which happens right after this, by the way. That happened in 1953. And they initially tried it by themselves, and they failed miserably and got kicked out of the country. So they had to come hat in hand to the CIA for them to insert Kermit Roosevelt to basically overthrow Iran. And so that is a very interesting observation, that they had basically too many Indians and not a chief, so that they learned that they probably are better off doing their own. Because again, the British was in Greece trying to stir up shit there too, and got so strung out that they weren't able to overthrow the government when they wanted to. The U.S. comes in, does what they need to have done, and basically saves the day. And that's around the same time frame as well. So as the Iran one. And so that is a very accurate observation, that seems to be a lessons learned out of this, is don't have multiple intel people. If one of those other ones are going to go try it on their own, then you'll have a backup with one of the other ones to come in.
Exactly, Colonel. And the other thing I'll note concerning all of this is, since we're now talking about a single entity such as the CIA doing the dirty work, from Asia on through South America, what the CIA did was install a strong arm of the CIA that was nationalistic to that specific nation. If I'm not mistaken here, because
so
as we did, like the KCIA or
so let me say something else here though. I think we would be mistaken if we say it was just the CIA from here on out, because what happened is the CIA took the lead, but they were not the only operation. Because remember when we overthrew Lumumba, you had Otto Skorzeny with the OAS assisting. So they are very much NATO ran. And they pull in assassins from other Gladio organizations, because you find Delachey throughout Latin America, and he definitely was a European, Gladio guy. You find that Yves Laurent, whatever his name was, from Portugal that ran Agenter Press. He's all over the place. He's in Africa. He's in Europe causing shit. He's in Latin America causing shit. So there's a cross utilization of assets, but they learned that the operation is going to be led by a single entity. Does that help?
Yes, I'll agree on that point.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's a very good point. Anybody else? Anybody want to talk about anything else? So I do.
I will say that, looking at this book particular, looking at some of the stuff about the Soviet Union and things that I really was unaware of, it makes it, this illuminates why Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill they made the agreement to let the Soviet Union have all of Eastern Europe and Berlin.
It does change your perspective from that. I agree.
Yeah.
Because the turmoil of those. So I'm kind of on the fence on that, because I think they thought I think Galen sold the idea to Alan Dulles that they had enough. All right. I'm thinking the best way to say that. So when Alan Dulles and Galen made the arrangement of saving Galen, because he had all of these stay-behind units throughout Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, and this is what he told Alan Dulles. So he got saved, installed in the German B&D as the guy that was going to deliver. And I think, and I have no corroboration of this, but it appears to me like, because they really want Russia, right? They want to overthrow Russia. They want all of the resources of Russia. And it appears to me that giving the Soviet Union those Eastern European countries with all of the stay-behind capacity that Galen brags about that he set up in there, and he did do that. But the Soviet Union, when they came back, were so fucking pissed off at the 25 million killed by Germans, they just wanted them all dead. And so they viewed all of those stay-behinds as a meticulous rooting out. And those, by the way, those stay-behind guys, they skinned people alive. The local citizens didn't like them. That's not what you're told today, because we want to make the Soviets look so bad. But the Romanians, the Czechs, all of them, Hungarians, they despised these fascist Nazis because they were murdering war criminals that took local villages and set the entire things on fire and just mass murdered, 25 million people. So no one liked them. But Galen saved his ass by telling Allen Dulles they were all in place. But in the meantime, the Soviet Union is basically hunting them down like dogs because they're dogs. And so by the time these things start launching, Albania and stuff like that, you don't hear people saying it in these books, but I think they're shocked, which is why they keep trying to find them. They keep going back because Galen has convinced them they're there. And so they go country after country after country looking for these Galen stay behind units because Galen told them they were there. And so I think their thought was that these people were going to rise up from behind the quote unquote Iron Curtain. And I think that's why that was made such a big deal. And they were going to discredit the Soviet Union with this rising up. And all they're going to have to do is basically go over and flick their finger, and these regimes are going to fall over because these quote unquote nationalists, which are really Nazis, are going to rise up and overthrow the Soviet occupation, which then of course would give the Soviet Union a bad eye. And they would be able to then ride the tide and do what they're doing right now by taking all of the former Soviet satellites into NATO. I think they anticipated doing that right away. I think this was going to be a steam engine rolling all the way through Eastern Europe, giving the Soviet Union a black eye, and then it would be a short skip and a jump to roll right into the Soviet Union, because at that time they had no nuclear weapons and supposedly we did. So I think there's a completely different thing that most people have not realized was behind all of this.
Can I inject something there? And I don't know if there's a correlation, but if you go back and you look at what the Reese Committee did, the work of
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
What's that?
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
Yeah, with Norman Dodd. Yeah. And I mean the investigation of all of these the foundations, and they essentially were open and honest about what they were trying to do was to merge the United States with the Soviet Union. And so to me it feels like NATO, with the stay behind armies in Western Europe, were trying to cause chaos there, and they were also doing the same thing behind the Iron Curtain to cause chaos there, to just keep everybody in a constant state of terror.
So most of the stay behind units in the Western Europe had not actually been formed yet. Those were formed in the later part of the 40s, once they stood up NATO, which, basically didn't happen until 1948 timeframe. So I
guess I'm speaking in an overarching.
I know, but I'm thinking about the chain of events leading up to that, and I understand that they said they were looking for a merging of it. That's bullshit. They wanted 100% control of it.
I understand that and agree with you 100%.
And I think their way of getting control was going to be handed to them by that stay behind thing to get the momentum going of basically Eastern Europe falling immediately and then just rolling right into, because why would you leave communism, right? Because at the same time they've started their psychological war on conditioning us to be anti-communist. And so all of these things are happening at the same time. And I'm not saying we should be pro-communist, by the way. But all of this stuff, the psyops part of the war, the actual physical part of the war, the covert part of the war, all happening at the same time. But what I think is the most convincing part of that entire theory is you see it playing out right now. So the last 30 years has basically been doing that exact same thing by taking one country. They just had to do it in a much slower way because their initial plan didn't pan out.
That makes sense.
Yeah, using those same Reese Committee philanthropic foundations, of course. Yeah, I just find it fascinating that so much of history has been hidden from us, and by searching on a few terms, we have been able to dig up an entire treasure trove that explains so much of what we see going on around us today that everybody else doesn't see because they don't know what we know. So I wanted to share with everybody how I started my day off. I was invited by Guru, who I don't see in here. He's probably out partying, or was out partying, so he's not up early like he usually is. But so he invited me a few days ago to I did not know he has his own radio program in Australia. And so he invited me to be on his radio program today. And it was timed so that I got to watch the Australian New Year being rung in over the harbor there in Sydney with a bunch of Australians on his, there was like, I think 5 other people. One was a lady from California, but his, co-radio people, whatever. It was amazing. We had a very good conversation and it was a lot of fun. So that's how I started my day. And it has been a wonderful day all around. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, something just sparked for me. So yesterday, I was fighting with someone on some post that you made. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Afghanistan. This was I researched back. They were saying that the Soviets, started the Afghan war, and that whole thing about that we had anything to do with it was a lie. And so I looked into it, and in the 1800s, the British were running crazy ops there, and they are after the Russians, and they call it, quote unquote, the Great Game.
Yep. The British was in there 3 different times. They tried to take Afghanistan 3 different times and lost all 3 times.
Peter Hopkirk actually wrote a book called The Great Game, and it was all about the tribes in Afghanistan and how they've been infighting for years, decades, centuries. So
a normal person is not going to understand anything that I talk about when I say that the Soviets were lured into Afghanistan under false pretenses, because they're still in, Rockefeller history lesson. But it is clear that we overthrew the king, got him out, and basically put our own guy in, and that the drumming up of the quote unquote communist movement inside of Afghanistan was what we just saw, what we see in every one of these cases, a false flag. So they did exactly the same thing. Kermit Roosevelt even admits to doing it in Iran, that the entire quote unquote communist movement that they're supposedly toppling the government to prevent from happening because that guy's clueless and is allowing it to happen is in itself a false flag. So they had created this fake communist movement, but no one outside of Afghanistan knows it's fake. And so all of the, powers to be in the State Department and in the CIA and all this other stuff, they start sending information to the Soviets that the communist movement is on the cusp of taking over Afghanistan and installing their own government there. And if only you would come help, that will happen. And they're up on the border actually antagonizing the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union, once they respond to the antagonism, find out that they're being allowed in to that area, and that there's basically kind of almost like the falling in or the falling back of a front line in order to trap you in kind of a pincher movement type operation. And so they went up, they antagonized them, they drop back, the Soviet Unions come in, and they just keep dropping back until they don't. And by that time, the Soviet Union is fully committed to the Afghanistan operation, and it does in fact become their Vietnam. And you have the State Department on record saying that was the entire intent of it, as well as the National Security Advisor. So, but you really have to dig to find that information. That is not information that is going to be in your, History 101 in college. You have to know who the names of the CIA operators are. You have to go back and look at all kinds of different material, declassified CIA documents to be able to piece that entire thing together. Miles?
And I'm sorry.
Go ahead, and then we'll go to Miles.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, everything that we talked about yesterday with the Carter administration, all the stuff that was done, laying the foundation for Afghanistan and ultimately Iraq and Saudi Arabia and all the stuff, that was all done under the Carter administration with Brzezinski and Turner and all those guys.
Yes. So, Miles, go ahead.
Oh, Colonel, long time no talk.
Not that long.
Oh, yeah, you're right. So I just want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to do some inside baseball on the front porch.
Sure, that was fun.
And I'm assuming the algorithms brought Colonel Kirk in there. I don't know how, I've never seen him before, but I got some confirmation on a conspiracy theory I've been talking about because of where he was and his status. And it was about the switches that went missing. Which I never really, I went like, I don't know if this is real, but he says, oh my God, I was involved in that. And did the shit hit the fan when that happened?
The nuclear switches?
Yes.
Well, that's in the BCCI book that we went through.
Okay, but he was there. And then right at the end, he gave us some encouragement before he had to leave to keep up the fight, and embrace your conspiracy theory stuff. And then, Bill Browder. If only people would know about Bill Browder and the Harvard boys, they would understand why they constantly attack Putin and Russia. I won't go into that, but you can research Bill Browder.
Well, we've talked about Bill Browder a lot on here. Him and Safra, his financier, and them trying to buy everything after the fall. We're very familiar with that. So, yeah. Okay. Who's next, Bridget?
I believe it's Carrie.
Okay.
Hey, so I just had an idea that maybe Marx was actually a British op. So, because he was living in London and he's Jewish.
Okay. What did you say, Thea? Something going on?
Twanging. That was supposed to be twanging, but you may want to turn it back to voice isolation because it was just picking up some background noise.
Okay.
Some movements or something.
Okay. Hold on. I had it sitting on the charger. I'll hold on to it.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else?
They are messing with the space. I know SR has a question or is requesting, but for whatever reason, I show him as co-host and requesting at the same time. So I get nothing.
Okay. All right. So SR71, can you talk? Let me remove him and I'll bring him back up. Yeah, that's weird.
And everybody, while we have a second, please repost the space. We are still getting throttled. We're still getting messed with. We sent umpteen requests on why our sound only seems to be going in and out.
I just got the co-host. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, they're screwing with me today. What can I say? Plus, I got a thunderstorm going on over here, but shouldn't affect the rise of bios. But gee whiz, what can I say?
Yeah.
Anyway, what I was really interested in is this guy, Philby? Is that his name?
Kim Philby? Yeah.
Kim Philby. And the damage he did to the CIA and agents and what was going on. And if you take a look at how much damage he did, the way that I read it, there were a lot of agents that were discovered at that point in time by Russia.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, a ton.
Yes.
And I'm sitting here saying, it doesn't seem like that affected the CIA one bit.
Well, I don't know that I would say it didn't affect them. I mean, it affected the missions that they were running. See, the whole thing about the CIA, they're very careful about using other people for plausible deniability. So it's not necessarily going to get them per se, but there were many of the operations the CIA was running, like the ones into Albania. They had ones into Ukraine that were sabotaged as a result of Philby taking that information back to the Soviets. So, yeah, I don't.
Well, guess what surprised me more out of that deal there is that after Albania and knowing what had happened in Albania, they tried the same damn thing in Ukraine following the same playbook.
Yes.
And it just blew my mind. Now, what they should have known Russia knew this stuff already.
So again, that's where I go back to the other information in other books that I know. So Galen sold Alan Dulles that he had stay-behinds in all of those areas. So I think when it failed, and they were there for years in Albania because they believed that they were just missing the stay-behind units. They weren't able to get to them, get in touch with them, whatever, because they believed Reinhard Galen. And I think when they weren't able to do it in Albania, going to Ukraine, because the Germans had been in Ukraine a lot longer, and you had a lot of the Ukrainian immigrants in Germany that would have been able to corroborate the stay-behind capability. But Reinhard Galen had not been anywhere near Ukraine in a couple of years. They had no idea that the Soviets came in and that the fellow countrymen had ratted out the mass murder OUN guys and such. So in the couple of years between the end of the war and the beginning of these operations, the Soviet Union was very busy, basically, and that's why you hear these people talk about all of the people that the Soviet Union shot or executed. Well, they executed Nazis that were in stay-behind units that were discovered because the locals who had watched their children be skinned alive by these Nazis were turning their ass in. And then that's turned around and sold to us as the Soviets being executioners, when in fact, there is a plausible story to be told that all they were doing is getting rid of the Nazis. So there's just so much more to this than what we've been told. And there are pieces that you can verify, and there's pieces that you can hypothesize, like the second and third order effects of what we can verify. So what we know for sure is that Reinhard Gehlen said he had all of these, I mean, like 50,000, tons and tons of trained stay behind units throughout all of the now Soviet occupied East Europe. And we know that for sure. We know that the CIA mounted operations based on that information. We know that for sure. What we also know for sure is none of them worked. But I think it was they're working hand in hand with Galen, going, oh, well, if we just try this one over here, or we just try this one over here, thinking that maybe just that one got taken out. So there's got to be these other 10. And then you get to another one, you're like, well, shit, they got 2 of them. Well, that means there's still 8 left. And by the time you figure out that there's none left, that they basically executed them all, you got egg on your face and you look dumb. Miles, go ahead.
Colonel, I have a hypothetical question. So where would we be at if Russia had fallen to the international syndicate and we were on our own right now?
Well, we wouldn't be on our own. We'd have fallen too.
Okay, that's a good answer. So that shows you how important Russia's been to check the international syndicate.
Well, think about this, Miles. The only thing that staved off, so we were going to be saved for last. We were going to be the most difficult because of the fact that we have guns and blah, 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 and we're independent. So they wanted the experience of overthrowing all of these other governments so they could have the momentum and the capability to overwhelm us, and do it from the inside out. Worst case scenario, outside in. But anyway, so the only thing that kept any of these countries fighting, to include the Congo, Chile, Nicaragua, any of them, for any length of time in pushing back the CIA in this dictator fascist movement, was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the only one that dared supply arms to any of them. The Soviet Union was the only entity that stood up to the CIA international syndicate tyranny anywhere. So they had marshaled all avenues of control, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN. They controlled every mechanism of power economically, the US dollar, by working the deal with the Middle East. They controlled, they being the international syndicate, they controlled everything. And so you have President Allende that gets elected down in Chile, and they immediately, well, even before he was elected, they committed economic terrorism on him. They were starving the Chilean people. They were blocking the harbor. They, had basically taken down a lot of the telephone service because that was being ran by ITT, blah, blah, blah. So their only hope when the arms, because now they killed that senior army guy, and the only guy left is Pinochet, and he's corrupted. So Allende's only hope when he calls for help, not realizing what's going on is being funded by the United States, and the United States basically says, piss off. His only hope is to, he went to the UN, he did all of the right things, is to call the Soviet Union and ask for weapons. And then, of course, as soon as you do that, you're labeled a communist. And so the Soviet Union basically provided the last element of hope to all of these entities around the world to stave off a political, economic, and militarily approach to overthrowing their government. And if the Soviet Union had not been available to stave off and kind of buy more time, expend more resources, all of that stuff, this would have been 1, 2, 3, we're done. Because after World War II, they set up every element of power to do it. They set up the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, NATO, and they had all the mechanisms to do all of that. And that was their plan, one world government. Go ahead, Miles.
Well, if I have a discussion about this and I get a pushback on the Bolsheviks, so the Bolsheviks, weren't they part of the New World Order? So didn't they have to deal with the Bolsheviks at some point?
So if you go back to Anthony Sutton's book, the Bolsheviks and Hitler and FDR were all in the same boat. They were creating what was a psychological warfare of a left and a right, as if they were polar opposites and on different teams. So their plan, as hatched in the RIIA and the CFR and, the British Roundtable, Fabian Society, and all that other stuff, was you create both sides and then you push everybody into the third way. And that document is actually called the Madrid Circular, and the revised after World War II version of it was talked about in the book called The Third Way. And they basically funded, so Anthony Sutton traces all of the money. The same people in New York City at 120 Broadway and the same people in the city of London funded the Bolshevik Revolution. We went in after they took over. We gave them railroads. GE went in and basically electrified all of the Bolshevik Russia. So all of the American people, we actually sent a Red Cross mission over that had nothing to do with the Red Cross. Harriman was on it. Warburg was on it. All of the 120 Broadway people went over to Russia after the Bolshevik planted their flags there, and basically was bringing in railroads and electrical equipment as they carried out the Tsar's gold. They were all paid and remanufactured through Sweden, who recoined the Tsar's. They boiled it down and put a stamp on it, but it was Tsar's gold. And so they basically had infiltrated and gotten into Russia as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, then later, FDR gets into office, and it is the same people. If you go back, and Anthony Sutton has all the charts in his book of who funded what and where the money came from. All the people that got FDR into office was at 120 Broadway. Then you go to Hitler, and you find out that all of the people at 120 Broadway and the city of London, there's all kinds of money passing back and forth. They actually paid for the secretary that wrote Mein Kampf. That was on them. They paid for that secretary to sit in that jail in Austria and basically help. He didn't make shit up, but he was like the secretary that wrote the words down for Hitler's Mein Kampf. And Anthony Sutton traces all of that stuff. And so...
You mean Hess?
I don't remember his name. So the idea that they fomented in our, so we know that Nazism, the socialist light New Deal that Roosevelt put in, although the original real fascist deal was overturned by the Supreme Court. So we settled for the New Deal, which was socialism light. All three of those things, you're going to have every single one of those things. Socialism, Bolshevikism, and fascism are all total government control and all lean on one end of the spectrum that is total government. There's not a right and left element of that. And so it's a false argument to label it one on the left and one on the right. But that's what they did. And that's what they can convince through a psychological warfare all of us to repeat those talking points, which is why I will not use the word left and right, because it's lazy. Those are lazy terms because they don't accurately describe what we're talking about. I use the word fascism, and fascism as a form of government is basically what they wanted. And it's best illustrated in the totalitarian model that Mussolini used, which is you have a government, but they're not actually running it. You have the corporate giants that are actually in control, and they just have Mussolini there. And it's not fair to say it's a figurehead, but in a shortcut version of it, the Mussolinis are the figurehead. They're the guy that's going to carry around the big hammer and beat everybody with it so that oligarchs can do whatever they want with the people, and you're never allowed to have unions or workers' rights or anything else because you're going to be the slaves to the oligarchs. And that's what totalitarianism is. It's not government ran everything like communism is. And the fascist element of that obviously comes in when you add other elements to it. But just generically, I call it fascism. So you have what was sold to us is you have communism on the left, and fascism really is a right, like, like literally Republican slash some type of a racist right issue. And it never was that. If you go back and look at fascism, it was 100% basically something that looks exactly like totalitarianism, where you have a corporate structure that basically runs everything. And then you have this kind of almost figurative government that are the enforcers for this. And then you can call it something, almost like a democracy, which I believe is exactly what we're living in today. We are living in a fascist government where the oligarchs run everything, and you have a figurative government that pretends like it's in charge. It's not in charge of anything. The corporate interest through lobbying owns our government. We don't. They certainly don't work for us. The CIA certainly doesn't work for us. And so that's what I tell people when they want to talk to me about the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are just one piece of a pie, but it's the same pie. You got something else, Miles?
Yeah. Were you in the space when Colonel Kirk was talking about Roosevelt's son?
What about him?
He said that he went to China and his father asked him, "You tell me who's going to win this battle between Mao and Chiang Kai-shek." Were you in there at that time?
No.
Okay, so he said that he came back to his dad and said, yeah, Mao's going to win. Now, Colonel Kirk said he thought Chiang Kai-shek was going to lose because of their military structure was set up like ours.
That you cut out. Say that again.
He said that Chiang Kai-shek was going to lose this war because their military structure was set up like ours, and Mao had a different structure.
Yeah, that's
in his
not true.
military.
That's not true. So,
Okay. That's
so
why I wanted to ask you.
yeah. So Chiang Kai-shek was a warlord. He didn't actually have a military structure. He was a warlord. What he had that made him more notable than everybody else is basically a monopoly on the opium trade. And his overtaking of the other warlords to kind of end up as the leader of the KMT and kind of the main obstructionist to Mao was the ability to manipulate people based and to fund himself much better than everybody else, because he was kind of on the tether initially of all of the opium being brought in by the British through India. So he's basically their guy in theater in mainland China on this opium run. And that gave him a lot of clout, that gave him a shit ton of money. And that's what brought him to be the big foe of, and I don't know who he's talking about as far as Roosevelt's son, unless he's talking about Kermit, which is Teddy Roosevelt's grandson. Because Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, did spend some time in the Far East. I'm not aware of any of Roosevelt's actual children being over there, but Kermit was definitely there. Kermit is the guy that, was overthrowing Iran. So, I mean, I can look into that to see if there was any other Roosevelts over there at the time. But the idea that that Mao was underestimated, because everybody, I mean, MacArthur, all of those people were backing William Pauly. All of the ambassadors over there were all backing Chiang Kai-shek. So they were doing it covertly because they couldn't do it overtly. And because at that point, we're already past, we got into the Korean War in 1950. So, at the same time, and again, there is a lot of information out there that the Korean War was fought in order to insert Chiang Kai-shek into Northern Korea and then eventually back into China to overtake Mao. So they never took the fact that they lost mainland China laying down. They tried not only through that venture, but if you guys remember when we went to Vietnam, we found out that they'd actually put Chiang Kai-shek in charge of Northern Vietnam in the immediate aftermath of World War II as the quote unquote supervising power to finish kicking the Japanese out and set up a unified peninsula, which of course didn't work very well. And Ho Chi Minh was having none of it because he didn't agree with Chiang Kai-shek's dealing in opium or anything else. And he basically ran him out of town. So, yeah. Ron, go ahead.
Real quick, when you talked about the secretary, that's the guy who was with Hitler in his cell at Landsberg was Rudolf Hess, and towards Rudolf Hess, I now think I have a better understanding of why Hitler sent Hess to on a one-way mission to try to get the British to come to their reasons and not continue with World War II. He sent him up because Hess had met, I think it was the Duke of Edinburgh or whoever it was some member of the royal family. He befriended him at the 1936 Olympics, and Hitler sent him on a mission up there to England to try to talk some sense, to try to get like a back channel message to them. They put Hess in prison for life. He never saw the light of day again.
Yeah.
And to me, that makes a whole lot more sense if he they wouldn't want him talking because it was them that put him there in the first place.
Yes.
So there, that makes a lot more sense. Now, in terms of Chiang Kai-shek losing the peninsula, I know you've read The Secret Team by Prouty. He talks in there about how there was, all of the arms that were being gathered in Southeast Asia once they had expelled the Japanese off of mainland. They put all these arms there, staging them for an invasion of Japan. Well, when the invasion of Japan didn't happen, they sent half of the arms down to the Korean Peninsula and the other half down into Vietnam. Essentially, basically setting the stage for Korea and the Vietnam conflicts. But he also said that there was a bunch of munitions that were being sent up to, and those fell into the hands of the communists, not Chiang Kai-shek. He mentioned in there, and I think I'm getting it right, that there were a bunch of munitions that were coming over from Europe on a ship, and the ship was in the Indian Ocean, and it was the U.S. State Department that told them to throw everything overboard. We don't want that to get to Chiang Kai-shek. We want China to become communist. Does that ring a bell? Have you heard that?
I've read his book. I don't believe that at all.
Okay.
Only because of this. If you look into, which we did extensively, into the career of William Pauly and him creating the Flying Tigers, basically General Chenault was kind of the face of it, but William Pauly had the Curtiss aircraft franchise over there. He's the one that built out the Taiwanese Air Force. Basically, this guy is everywhere doing everything. He owned the airline into Cuba. He owned all of the busing transportation in Cuba. He owned massive sugar plantations in Cuba. He's the ambassador at a bunch of places we overthrew in Latin America. This guy is literally the jack of all trades. So he personally, with his front companies, buy Chiang Kai-shek's Navy. And so what is more likely, and with all due respect to Colonel Prouty, I think his book is marginal based on all of the other information. It seems to me that he reveals things that everybody already knew that has been involved in this area of study. So he didn't basically tell us anything new. But he did say things like what you just said. So there's no fucking way the CIA is going to dump arms overboard. What that actually translates into, those all went into covert missions. Those were all taken and either sold in black market weapons deals, or they were taken into those local areas and used in stay behind units so that there's no accountability for on. And
God, that makes so much that makes so much sense. That just makes way too much sense.
Yes.
I'm embarrassed to say that I fell for that. About, like what you just said.
Well, again, you have so many other areas of interest. This is all I do. And so literally that's how I came to wear Gladio glasses. Is I look, to me, is the most simplest answer in all of these cases end up being eventually proven to be the answer. And so we have seen it before in other situations where supposedly something got lost, only to find out that it showed up over here in some BCCI deal where they're reselling it. And I mean, I was shocked that they skim off fighters. They skim off helicopters. There is no limit to the skimming that the CIA does. And that's what I would say about everything that was left in Afghanistan. I think that whole thing is a bunch of bullshit.
I agree.
There was people that came in right behind it, took every bit of that shit and sold it on the black market.
I agree. Well, and the same thing that happened with all the Russian munitions. I mean, back during in the 1990s, shoot, you could buy AK-47s and 7.62 by 39 ammunition. I mean, it was on the cheap. I mean, it was pennies on the dollar. That was actually cheaper than buying 22 long rifle. It was just, I mean, it was everywhere because the Eastern Bloc countries were just selling everything off.
Well,
So
primarily Bulgaria, but also let me tell you that what I found out when I researched the BCCI garbage is that all of the money that we were pouring into Pakistan to pay the Afghanistan for, arming against the Soviets, that's not actually what happened. We were taking 20-year-old weaponry out of Bulgaria, and we were actually putting that into Afghanistan and pocketing all of the money that we were supposedly giving to the ISI. Now, we paid off the ISI, obviously, but a lot of that money, so if you got $1 billion, I could spend 100 million buying all of Bulgaria's excess bullshit. I gave that to and there's plenty of reports that what the weaponry that the Afghan military was getting during the Soviet piece of that was actual from the Soviet Union. So, and then again, they just skim off the rest. A lot of that went money laundered through BCCI into other areas to do covert operations. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo something you were saying about the left and right, and that it's based in Hegelian philosophy, which is the dialectic. And it's really repulsive and disgusting and anti-life. It's absolutely not organic, completely manipulative. It's one of the most horrific things any brain has ever come up with. And I wanted to also say that, Marx, there was a whole contingency of people dealing with what do we do? What do we do? Let's build a new structure. And he was part of that, but he was a socialist. And then, he came up with the communism thing, and there was a huge break in the people that were involved with trying to build a new structure because he demanded to have a central command. And no one wanted that. Everyone saw that structurally as absolute death, total fascism. And so that makes me really think that he was an operative. He was totally an operative, I think. Because then, it's set up in China and Russia. And who wants to kill China and Russia forever? The British.
Yeah, it does make you wonder about that. That's absolutely correct. All right, guys, we're at 6 o'clock. I'm hungry. I've got to go fix dinner. I want everybody to have a wonderful, happy New Year. We will not be here tomorrow, but we will be back on Thursday. So have a wonderful
Happy New Year, Colonel. Thanks. Great space.
Thank you. Happy New Year's to everybody. And we will see you on Thursday. Okay, let's finish up over here on Rumble. I want to take a look. Love you, Donnie Vision. Finally got the sound. Mao was a Yaley. Well, it does seem like all of the leaders that they pick around the world are Western educated. I've definitely noticed a pattern with that. Hit the enable button at the top of the screen. Private companies that are important to the national interest, high level cooperation. Yeah, I think that's how come we ended up with too big to fail, because they're just setting the stage for that exact thing to happen here, which is how you protect the oligarchs against the competitors. Yeah. So I definitely think that there was that constant churning behind the scenes a long time ago to begin preparing us for the eventual fascist dictatorship being set up here. And you can kind of see it once you go around and you start looking at what they did other places. Because I've argued ever since I figured out all of this stuff that the Phoenix program that we used in Vietnam and that the Brits used before us in Malaysia was actually set, excuse me, set up here using FEMA and the different quadrants. It looks exactly like the Phoenix program, and their 15-minute cities look just like the new villages that were set up. You have to check in and out. They control everything. It's the exact same program. So anyway, you guys have a wonderful, happy new year. And I will see you guys on Thursday. Thanks for being here.